Today is an excellent opportunity to learn. One of the things as lawyers that we always do when we sit down with young lawyers or others is we tell war stories. And war stories are where the rubber hits the road, because that's actual experience. Well, what we're bringing to you today is an individual who was involved in one of the largest frauds in history. He's a chief financial officer. He lived it. He understands it. When compliance officers talk about the fraud triangle, they almost always ask, well, how could this happen? Or could it happen in my organization? Today, you're going to hear the story about how all that happened at Health South. And I'm going to be a shameless plug for this gentleman because I've actually read this book, and it is a page turner. It's wonderful. It's called Health South, Wagon to Disaster. It tells the absolute inside story. And if you don't get enough of it today, please buy the book. I guarantee you won't get enough. And not only has this gentleman lived this, but he learned from it. And he's come back around and published a textbook, the Ethics Playbook. He not only teaches at universities, but also in organizations such as your own to help those folks that espouse a culture of compliance and ethics to actually learn how to do it. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce my friend, Aaron Beam.
I saw this image, much better, on Facebook, and I liked it. I thought the little girl looked so nice and innocent, and I discovered that I knew the artist. I had met her when she was 10 years old in Birmingham, Alabama, and she's now in her mid-40s. And I contacted her and I asked her if I could buy the painting. And I named the painting Ethel, kind of a play on ethics. And studies show, and common sense would tell you, that you can stay on track with ethics, safety, or almost anything if you're given frequent reminders to do so. She hangs in my den at home. I see her every day when I'm home. If I give you my business card today, Ethel's on the back. If you go to my website, first thing you'll see is Ethel. And I would encourage you to have something in your life that reminds you of how important ethics is. It was March 19th of 2003. I was living in Fairhope, Alabama, which is across the bay from Mobile. And it was about time for the evening news to come on. I went into my den, I turned on the TV. The announcer said it was NBC out of Mobile. He said, we opened tonight's news with a breaking story out of Birmingham, Alabama. Massive accounting fraud uncovered at Health South. It's estimated that there's almost $3 billion worth of bogus numbers on their books. At that moment, I knew probably in the not too distant future, I would be in prison. How did it all happen? I first met Richard Scrushy in the summer of 1980. I was living in Houston, Texas, and I had recently passed the CPA exam. I actually majored in economics when I was in college, but after being out of school for more than 10 years, I had taken enough accounting to sit for the exam, and I passed it. And I was at a point in my career where I wanted to advance my job status, and I'd never worked with or for another CPA. So I decided I needed to work for a big company. So I decided, I answered an ad in the Houston Chronicle for a position, a controller position at LifeMark Corporation. LifeMark was a for-profit hospital company headquartered in Houston, Texas. And I went in for the interview, and the interview was with Richard Scrushy. And I immediately knew that I'd met somebody very, very different. All during the job interview, my head was just spinning. I was dazzled by the guy. And by the end of the interview, I was totally convinced that that was the best job I could possibly have in Houston, Texas. But as I was driving home, I kept thinking about the guy. And by the time I got home, I told my wife, and what I told her that day has since been quoted in the New York Times. I told her that I thought I'd met maybe the most brilliant businessman I would ever meet, or maybe the biggest con artist I would ever meet. Richard offered me the job. I reported to work, and I'd been at my desk for about 5 minutes. I basically just walked in the front door. Richard came in, he said, Aaron, I'm presenting a contract to my boss, and it's a contract I think what you signed. I'd like for you to sit in on my presentation. I said, sure, Richard. We went into his boss's office, he introduced me, And he said, Aaron and I worked on this contract for hours last night. I hadn't worked on anything. Today, after everything has happened, I truly believe that he told that lie to size me up. He thinks 4 and 5 steps ahead of most people, and he wanted to see how I would behave being included in a lie. I'm not a particularly assertive kind of person. I didn't take him to task over it, but he always has a motive when he's saying something. I worked for him for almost 4 years at LifeMark. We managed portions of hospitals, respiratory therapy, physical therapy, and pharmacy. Richard was a respiratory therapist and I was his financial guy. And I did learn a lot from him. I never worked in a large publicly held company. I'd always worked for very small companies, and I did learn a lot from him. But the first thing you do learn about Richard when you meet him is that he has a big ego. I'm 78 years old, and I've never met a man with a bigger ego than Richard Scrushy. But like I say, I did learn a lot about it from him. After being there for about 4 years, I came in one morning and my Wall Street Journal was waiting for me in my desk. And the headline on the Wall Street Journal that day was AMI and LifeMark to merge. AMI was a much larger hospital company out of California. And the article said that once the merger was complete, the new company would be headquartered in California and the Houston operation would be closed. I didn't like the sounds of any of that. I didn't know if I'd be part of the merger, and I didn't particularly want to move to California. But what happens when large companies like this merge, and these were 2 New York Stock Exchange companies, venture capitalists will come around to see if someone has an idea for a startup company. Citicorp Venture Capital out of San Francisco contacted Bill Mackey, the chairman of the board, and asked if he knew of a person that might want to start their own company. And he immediately said, Richard Scrushy is your man. He's absolutely brilliant. We made him a full vice president when he was only 26 years old. And he's been talking to us about doing things outside of the hospital to lower healthcare costs. As you're probably all aware, the cost of healthcare has been front page news way back into the 80s. And it was Richard's idea that the way to lower healthcare costs is get people out of the hospital as fast as you can. And he felt like many things being done inside the hospital could be done on an outpatient basis, a much lower cost setting. He convinced Citicorp to put $1 million into a startup company to open a chain of outpatient rehab centers. And I was at the dinner when he convinced the venture capitalists to do it. And it was literally on the back of a napkin kind of presentation. He got a commitment for $1 million to start a company over dinner. Now, he had his $1 million, his startup money. He needed a management team. He wanted me to be the CFO of the new company. And I was kind of ready to get away from Richard. I'd learned that he told lots of white lies. His ego was oppressive, but he's always a good salesman. He said, Aaron, put in $5,000. You'll get 100,000 shares in the company. That's a nickel a share. He said, you got to realize Citicorp is paying $1 a share for their 1 million shares. So your $5,000 is already worth 100,000 based on what they're paying. I like the sounds of that. I like the concept of lowering healthcare costs, and I made the decision to go with Richard in his new company. Now, Richard was from Alabama, so we moved to Birmingham, Alabama. We opened our first outpatient centers, and we were off and running. Now, our first outpatient center, we tried to make it look like a fitness center or a spa. We did not want the patient to feel like they were going back into a building full of sick people. We charged less than the acute care hospitals did for the same procedure, and it worked. Our first center made more money than we thought it would. It broke even sooner than we thought it would. And I kind of knew early on that, wow, I may be on the ground floor of something pretty exciting here. During this first year that we were in business, I came into the office one morning early. I'm usually the first person in the office, and Richard had gotten there before me. And he had drawn this stick figure image of people pulling a wagon. When everybody got there, he gave us like a motivational speech. He said, look, you're not working as a team. He said, look at this drawing. You're like this drawing here. The two guys out front holding the handle are doing a pretty good job, but some of you are riding in the wagon. Some of you are on the sidelines looking at the wagon. You know, I need everybody out front pulling the wagon. And this became a company motto, pull the wagon. So he had this exact drawing reproduced and framed, and it hung in the lobby of every Health South facility next to a large picture of himself. At the end of the year, if you were an outstanding employee, you maybe got 100 shares of stock, and you got a little red wagon. It was called the Pulling Wagon Award. When I wrote my book in 2009, my wife actually gave me the title. She said, call it Health South, a Wagon to Disaster. As we started opening these outpatient centers, we noticed there was a need for rehabilitation hospitals, specialty hospitals that did more intensive rehab. It's not the type of hospital where you would go to you had a heart attack, you're suffering from cancer, maybe you've had a severe head injury, that sort of thing. So we got into that business. Pretty soon we realized that outpatient surgery was becoming a big business. Years ago, like when I was a little boy, a doctor would not cut on you at all unless you were in a hospital. Today, 60% of all surgeries are done outpatient. They cut on you that day, you go home that day. So as we grew Health South, we had three main businesses: outpatient surgery, rehab hospitals, and outpatient rehab. Within just 2 years, we were talking to investment bankers about going public. We did several more rounds of venture capital, but we didn't want to keep giving up large chunks of ownership, and we wanted to go public as soon as we could. I think maybe the most important meeting, or one of the most important meetings in the history of the company, took place with some bankers from a firm out of New York City called Drexel Burnham. Two of the bankers had flown to Birmingham to talk to Richard and I about going public, and they spent the entire day with us. And at the end of the day, the banker says, man, your facility looks great, your employees are sharp, your business plan is sound. He said, but you're still losing money. You're what we call a startup company. There's nobody public doing exactly what you do, and we really can't register your stock and take you public until we know you can make a bottom line profit in this business. He said, you tell me your centers lose money when you first open them, which is not unexpected, but you're opening a lot of centers. He said, I'm curious, how are you accounting for those startup losses? I very proudly said, well, we're being conservative and we're expensing our startup losses. No. Capitalize those costs. Put them on the balance sheet, write them off over several years. If you do, I think you're going to be profitable sooner than you're projecting, and we'll take you public. Richard went berserk. Aaron, why are you letting the accounting tail wag the dog? I'm out here killing myself trying to get this company public, and your silly accounting is hurting the company. I'm embarrassed that this man had to fly down from New York City and explain something so simple to you. Let me tell you what your job is as CFO. It's to make the bottom line look good, and don't you ever forget that. I redid our numbers, I redid our projections, I ran it by our auditors. They said it was okay, but they warned me. They said, look, this type of thing, as you're probably aware, can easily be abused. Don't you guys abuse it. And of course, we abused the hell out of it. So starting day one, we were probably putting things on our balance sheet that should have stayed on the P&L. But sure enough, within just a few months, we were showing a profit and we registered to go public. We registered to sell, tentatively to sell 2 million shares, tentatively priced at $8 to $10 a share. And as you're probably aware, before you start trading, you file with the SEC, and while they're approving your deal, you go on a roadshow. You go to New York, Boston, Chicago, San Francisco, LA, to all the major financial centers, and you present primarily to institutional investors. Richard was magnificent. He had the audience in the palm of his hand. The final roadshow is always in New York City. That's the day before your stock starts trading, the day before you actually price your stock. And when he finished his presentation, he got a standing ovation. And the investor sitting next to me was shaking his head. He said, I've never seen anything like this. He said, people do not applaud on roadshows. He said, all my years on Wall Street, I've never seen anybody get a standing ovation. He said, the funny thing is, you guys should not be going public. Your company is not even 3 years old. Your audited top line is only $5 million. You and Richard have no track record that you can run a public company. He said, but you're gonna get the deal done because Richard Scrushy is the best salesman I've ever heard on a roadshow. We did get the deal done, not at $8 to $10 a share, but at $6.50 a share. So, but we got it done, and we were off and going. The good news is, almost immediately the stock started trading up. Within only a few months, we were well over $20 a share. You can do the arithmetic. I'm now a millionaire. I had my 100,000 shares. I'd also gotten 50,000 in options at $1 a share during the startup years. It changed me a little bit. When I started the company with Richard, I didn't have a net worth of $20,000. I was paycheck to paycheck, like most people. But now I had all this money. As soon as I could, I sold a little stock, and I went out and paid cash for a new Mercedes. That was fun. I'd never paid cash for a car before. I'd never driven a Mercedes. As the years went by and the stock just kept going up and up and up, I built about a 7,000 square foot home in Birmingham. I had a condo in the French Quarter in New Orleans. I owned 3 beach houses in Florida. Every year I bought a new Porsche or BMW, whatever kind of luxury car I wanted to drive that year. And you may have noticed I'm wearing this very nice Hermes tie, which I bought $30,000 worth of. They're really, really good looking ties, don't you think? Now, for Richard Scrushy, it was a big deal. I did not know it, but he had always wanted to be a rock and roll star. So in the top left-hand corner there, he formed a rock band and he named it Proxy. And he began playing at company events and in nightclubs where he could get a gig. And the band didn't take off like he thought it should. Problem was, he wasn't a very good singer. So he had the theory that he could be a country star. So he went to Nashville, he bought himself a black cowboy hat. He hired people from Sawyer Brown and the Oak Ridge Boys to back him. He produced an album and he wrote a song called Honk If You Love to Honky Tonk. And he sent out memos nationwide to all of our employees telling them to call their radio station and have them play Honk If You Love to Honky Tonk. But he also started always carrying a gun in his briefcase. And as the years went by, he hired bodyguards that followed him everywhere he went. And he became almost Hannibal Lecter-like. He had this huge ego, and now he's a multimillionaire, and he was very difficult to deal with. But the stock was going up, and everything was fine. We grew to be a very, very big company. Our business model was sound. Our basic business strategy was to align ourselves with the best orthopedic surgeons in the United States. In Birmingham, Dr. Jim Andrews practiced at our hospital. Dr. Andrews, for many years, and maybe still is, considered the best orthopedic surgeon in the United States. He did Bo Jackson's hip, Troy Aikman's shoulder. He's the doctor that told the New Orleans Saints that Drew Brees could still throw the football after his really bad injury. So we had that kind of reputation, and we were a very good company, and we were making a lot of money. By I forget the exact dates now, but by 1995, we started taking on some of Richard's big personality. We started buying jet airplanes, which he learned to fly. By 1995, we owned 12 jets, 2 Gulfstreams, which are about a $40 million airplanes. We had 2 of them. A typical day for Richard and I would be to go to our hangar, get on our Gulfstream, fly up to Teterboro Airport in New Jersey. On the way up, somebody would prepare us breakfast. We'd land in Teterboro. There'd be a helicopter waiting for us. We'd fly into Manhattan. There'd be a limo waiting for us. We'd spend the day meeting with investors at Plaza Hotel, Trump Towers, wherever. That night, we'd fly back home. We never had to stop in Atlanta. You have to live in the South and understand why that's slightly amusing. So it was quite the deal. You might say, wow, what a success story. What could go wrong? One word, really, and that word is greed. If you ask the average guy on the street, why do people commit fraud, or financial fraud? They're going to say, well, they're greedy. They cheat to make money. And that's true in large part. But many people get involved in fraud that's for other reasons, that is putting money directly into their pocket. But for HealthSouth, it was a big deal, particularly in the case of Richard Scrushy. In 1995, he told the Birmingham Press and the media that he wanted to be a billionaire. He said, I want to be the richest man in the state of Alabama. And I estimated in 1995, based on his public holdings, that he was worth about $600 million. In 1997, he was one of the highest paid executives in the United States. He took home $110 million in that one year. LeBron James, Nick Saban, they make pretty good money. They don't make $110 million in 1 year. Now, Richard's board of directors were total yes men. They gave him anything he asked for because he was the man. He paid them a good salary. He gave them stock options. He let them fly around in our company airplanes. And guess what he asked for every year? Millions of stock options. And he understood if he could keep the stock price going up, he would pretty soon be a billionaire. Now, here's what he would do. He would meet with the stock analysts every year and ask the analysts, what do we need to earn next year for you to keep a strong buy on our stock? And they would tell him. And he would always say, we can do that, not a problem. It didn't matter what our projections said we were going to do. He simply promised the street whatever it took to keep that strong buy on our stock. And it was really okay the first 3, 4, 5 years, but over time, the analysts started noticing that our cash flow didn't match our earnings, and the stock began to trade down a little. In the summer of 1996, after being a public company for 10 years, we had missed our earnings really pretty badly. Up until that point, I'd been doing everything I could to keep the bottom line where Richard wanted it. I told the FBI when they interviewed me I was doing aggressive accounting, but it wasn't very good accounting. But in the summer of 1996, I met with my controller and my chief accountant, Bill Owens, and we decided that we couldn't keep doing the kind of accounting tricks we were doing, that we had to report numbers below street expectations. So we prepared ourselves to go into Richard's office and tell him that we were going to report numbers below the street. And I knew it was going to be about as much fun as telling him that he couldn't sing. But we went into his office, we laid it out. His face turned red. He started twitching. Get out of my office. Have you guys lost your minds? We are not going to report numbers below the street. If we do, the stock will crash. We'll be sued. Your stock options will be worthless. You won't be the rock stars in Birmingham anymore. He said, here's the problem. You guys have gotten lazy. You're smart. You know how to fix these numbers. You've done it before. Get back into your office and get these numbers to where they need to be. And he wouldn't let us leave. He kept cursing at us, telling us that we had to fix the numbers. Finally, Bill Owens, who had worked for our auditors, said, look, we have 1,500 operating units. I can make entries small enough and spread them through all the ledgers, 1,500 general ledgers, and I will get the numbers to where they need to be. And I'll make small enough entries that the auditors, he had worked for our auditors, they won't look at these entries because they won't trip their threshold to be examined. Now he said, I want you and Richard to know that I'll be crediting revenue we did not generate, and on the balance sheet, I'll be debiting assets we do not have. Richard thought about it for a moment, and he said, guys, this is our best option. We'll only do it this one time. Nobody will lose their job, stockholders won't get hurt, and you guys, you know everybody does this kind of thing. At that moment, I should have had the courage to stand up to Richard and say no. But I was weak, I was a coward. I knew he had a gun in his briefcase. I did not have the courage to stand up to him and do my job. I was on the board of directors, I was the chief financial officer. It was clearly my job to not let this happen. But that night, I let Bill Owens cook the books. The next day when I went into work, I felt like I had blood on my hands. I felt like people were staring at me. I did not realize what crossing that line would do to me mentally and emotionally. But from that day forward, my life was terrible. I was living a lie. I was ashamed to face people, and it was terrible. I've talked to my wife about it, and I said, look, I don't know what I can do here. I know I can't be the whistleblower. Richard had told us, he had in a meeting, he said, now guys, if we're ever caught, I'm going to deny everything. He says, I don't know what your game plan is, but I will deny everything. And I knew if I tried to fight him, he'd bring more lawyers, guns, and money to the party than I would. So my wife and I decided I would just leave the company, and I did. And so the fraud had only been going on for, I think, 3 quarters, and I left the company in 1997. And I moved out of Birmingham. I moved south to the Mobile area, and I bought 25 acres of land, sold all of my Health South stock, and I built a very nice house in Fairhope, Alabama. And I had a tennis court and a swimming pool, and for some reason I built a football field in my backyard. I'm not sure why I did that, but I did. I guess it was for my corgis to have some place to play on. But after being retired for about a year, I got a phone call from Richard. He said, Aaron, come to Birmingham, have lunch with me. He said, I want to talk to you. So I said, okay. And I drove up to Birmingham, had lunch with him in his private dining room with his private chef. He said, Aaron, come back to work. He says, we're making our numbers fine now. He said, you don't need to worry about that. He said, I want you back on the team. And I told him no, and I drove back home. 1998 passed, 1999, 2000, 2001, 2002. But in 2003, I heard that TV announcer say, massive accounting fraud at Health South. I might have just sort of passed out. I wanted to believe with all my heart that the fraud had stopped. And it had gone on for so long, I could not imagine that it had grown to be in the billions of dollars. But I knew I would probably be in prison pretty soon. So I expected my doorbell to ring any minute. It'd be the FBI, and they would handcuff me and take me away. So I called around to hire a criminal attorney. I'd never hired a criminal attorney before. And one fellow in Birmingham, in Mobile, kept being recommended, Donald Briskman. And I called him and told him my situation over the phone. He said, okay, Mr. Beam, let me call the feds in Birmingham. He said, I promise I'll call you back before the end of the day. About 2 hours later, he called back and he said, oh yeah, Mr. Beam, they want to talk to you. You need to be in my office at 8 o'clock in the morning. So my wife drove to downtown Mobile the next morning, and the first thing he said was, do not lie to me. Do not lie to the federal government. Your former employees have told them you were involved. The FBI has seized the Health South building. If you try to lie your way out of this, you're going to go to prison for a very long time. By now, my wife was in tears, and I was pretty upset. And the meeting was about to end, and I asked him if he needed a check for a retainer. And he said, yes. And he said, make the check for $100,000. And I said, you're kidding, aren't you? And that sort of made him mad. He said, I'm not kidding. And he said, it won't be the last check you're going to have to write me. So as I was making out the check, I asked him if I could get a t-shirt or something. And he gave me a coffee mug. Excuse me a minute. Three days later, I was in a federal building in Birmingham, Alabama. I'm sitting across the table from two FBI agents, two agents from the SEC, and that's not the Southeastern Conference SEC, and a whole room full of attorneys, and I'm a scared puppy. It went on all day. It was tape recorded. I was under oath. And at the end of the day, I didn't feel like I did very well because they kept asking me details back to 1995, 96, and this is 2003. But at the end of the day, the lead FBI agent said, Mr. Beam, we know a lot about this case. And from what we can tell today, you've been telling the truth. And he said, that's good. He said, so far, 17 people have come forward and admitted their guilt as you have today. He said only one key person denies knowing anything about it, Richard Scrishy. And he said, we will have to take Mr. Scrishy to trial, and we will want you to be a witness. Now, I didn't have to go to trial. I had pled guilty, so I was just waiting for a federal judge to sentence me. But they wouldn't do it until the trial was over, and it didn't begin for 2 years. So for 2 years, my wife and I had a pretty tough time. I knew I could go to prison for maybe 5, 10, 15 years. Health South stock had gone down to 8 cents. Investors lost billions, not millions. And my attorney said, they're going to take restitution against you. And he said, don't try to hide any of your assets because you'll be breaking even more laws, but be prepared to deal with paying some very large sums of money. Now, during this 2-year period, Richard did some interesting things. First thing he did is he left the church that he'd been attending and he joined an inner city church, and he gave that church $1 million. He also purchased a small television station in Birmingham, and he began every weekday morning preaching the gospel on television. That's the minister there that he gave the $1 million to, and that's the one of their sermons in the morning. He spent $20 million on his legal team. He had 7 different law firms representing him. He hired a publicist, and he hired a jury selection firm to help handpick the jury, which I didn't even realize was such a thing, but I'm sure you're all very aware of it. So he had a jury selection firm. And when the trial began, he never entered the courtroom that he didn't have a Bible in his hand. And he would sit there all day, and his friends, preacher friends and family would all have Bibles. The government wanted me to be the first witness. Lucky me. There were 4 other CFOs after I left, but the government felt like I was very professor-like, I guess it's the beard, and that I could do a good job of explaining to the jurors all of the financial terms they had to understand because this is a financial crime. So they put me on the stand, first witness, and I'm making good eye contact with the jury, and I'm explaining earnings per share, street expectations. I'm putting up financial statements with how I'm explaining, and they're falling asleep. They are bored out of their minds. That night on television, one of Richard's lawyers said they weren't going to take that approach. They were not going to bore these poor people with things they couldn't understand. We're just going to make it fun for them. He says, you need to watch this trial. It's going to be a lot of fun. So next day, he got me on the stand. He said, Mr. Beam, you've had an extramarital affair, haven't you? And I said, yes. I was under oath and I didn't want to lie. The next day, my wife wanted to come in the courtroom holding a sign saying she loved me. And this past June, we celebrated our 52nd wedding anniversary. And I've since learned since then that this turkey's been married 4 times, but I digress. He then got in my face and he said, Mr. Beam, when you went to New York City and met with investors, you lied. Mr. Beam, when you presented the numbers to the stockholders and the board of directors and the outside auditors, you lied. You are a cheat. You are a liar. You lie so much you don't know when you're telling the truth. I looked over at the jurors and their eyes were this big. They were paying attention. He then asked me, he said, Mr. Beam, did Richard Scrushy ask you to commit fraud? And I said, yes. He told me to fix the numbers. No, Mr. Beam, did he ask you to commit fraud? I tried to answer in a different way. Mr. Beam, did he use the word fraud? I said, no. He said, aha, fix numbers is what accountants do. You're the one that decided to commit fraud. And I looked over at the jurors and they were nodding their head up and down. The trial did last 6 months. The jury deliberated for 6 weeks. Not guilty, all charges. The legal community could hardly believe it. Enron, WorldCom, Tyco, Martha Stewart, they all went to prison, but not Richard Scrushy. Richard, a few days after the trial, even held a news conference to announce that he would be flying to Houston, Texas to advise Ken Lay on how to conduct the Enron trial. Within a few weeks or months, I was sentenced to prison. And for some reason, I got only 3 months in a federal prison in Mobile, Alabama. I don't know how many of y'all are doing something that might put you in prison, but if you ever have to go to prison, you better hope you go to a federal minimum security prison. It's not that bad. The worst thing about the place is the food. The budget to feed you is $3 a day. Every morning for breakfast, our breakfast consisted of canned peaches and grits. No eggs, no bacon. After about a week, I got the right to call my wife for the first time, and I was going on and on about how bad the food was. And she said, Aaron, you're in prison. So I quit complaining to her about the food. I got out of prison. I am now a felon. I am a felon today. That term never leaves you. I had lost nearly all of my money. I did manage to keep a few Hermes ties, but I needed a job and I could not get a job. As a felon, it's hard to get a job. So I started mowing lawns. Here I am in my 60s. When I was 15 years old, I earned my first dollar mowing lawns, and in my 60s mowing lawns again. But after doing it for about 2 years, I finally, at the encouragement of my wife, I spoke at LSU for the first time and gave my speech, and it was tough. I broke down and cried several times. It was very emotional to tell the story the first time, but I didn't think about doing it again because Enron, WorldCom, HealthSouth had all faded from the news. But about this time, something happened, something called the Subprime Debacle. People were taught how to lie on loan applications so they could buy homes that they couldn't afford. And y'all lived through it. When the real estate bubble burst, millions of people are upside down on their mortgages. And our large banks were in trouble. Our insurance companies were in trouble. And even our investment banking firms, including Goldman Sachs, were in Washington begging for a government bailout. So I started contacting universities, and today I've spoken to over 100 different universities all over the country, to groups like yourself. Why do I do it? This is a cover of Time magazine in 2009. Why Main Street Hates Wall Street. I grew up and decided to major in business because I was very proud of Wall Street. I was very proud of New York City. America was the financial capital of the world. But look at this. Why Main Street Hates Wall Street. When you lose trust, things go south pretty quickly. Enron was voted by Fortune magazine as the best company in the United States 2 years in a row. The best company in the United States, Enron. And it just crumbled to the ground. The largest accounting firm in the United States had to go out of business. And the public is saying, what's going on? Is everything rigged? Trust and integrity is the center of our economy. In 2015, I wrote my second book called Ethics Playbook, and I attempt to explain how these large corporate frauds happen. This is not somebody stealing $10 from petty cash. This is Enron. This is HealthSouth. In the center, you have a leader, a Bernie Ebbers, a Jeff Skilling, a Richard Scrushy. And when you look at these guys in the center there in the red circle, they have similar personalities. They have big egos. They're thought of as good leaders because they can get people to follow them because of maybe their charm or their intimidation. But they have one thing in common for sure. They totally measure success by how much money they can accumulate. Ethics does not make their radar screen. They don't physically cook the books. They have enablers, which is typically the CFO. Why does the CFO do it? I will be honest with you, greed was part of it, but lots of studies have been made about the relationship between the CFO and the CEO, and many times the CEO can intimidate and cause the CFO to start committing fraud. Now, there are fiduciaries that are supposed to prevent it from happening. Outside auditors, boards of directors, the SEC, accounting firms, law firms. These people have an obligation to look out for the public, not necessarily the company, but they don't always do that. One of the reasons, and I could talk for hours about it, but one of the reasons is, guess who compensates these people? They're typically compensated by the company, and that's a basic conflict of interest. Employees, rank and file employees, become involved over time. They don't blow the whistle because they don't want to be thought of as a whistleblower, and they just rationalize that what they're being asked to do has to be okay. And then society is part of the problem. We put the Richard Scrushys of the world on pedestals, and they begin to believe their own press. Before the fraud broke in Birmingham, Alabama, Highway 65, which runs through the heart of Birmingham, was renamed the Richard M. Scrushy Freeway. A medical building downtown was the Richard M. Scrushy Medical Building. Richard's wife had graduated from Troy State University, and they were trying to become a Division I football school. And HealthSouth gave them the money to enlarge their stadium. And of course, they named it the Richard M. Scrushy Football Stadium. But he also required the band at halftime to play Honk If You Love to Honky Tonk. In 1806, Webster's defined success as being generous, healthy, prosperous, and kind. Today, if you look it up, the definition of success in the dictionary is the attainment of wealth, fame, and rank. I guess the Kardashians are pretty successful. In 400 AD, St. Augustine said, complete abstinence is easier than perfect moderation. He was saying it's easier to try to be perfect than to try to figure out how to walk the wiggly line of being sort of perfect sometimes. It's very important to do that. I'll ask you today, what is the right moderate amount of texting while you're driving? 0, you can kill somebody. A wise old man was talking to a boy one day, and he said, there are 2 wolves always fighting inside of me. One is filled with anger and jealousy, and he lies. The other wolf is filled with love, joy, and truth. This battle rages inside of you and all men. The little boy said, which wolf will win? And the man said, the one you feed. You have to feed the good wolf. Being ethical is a learned discipline. You can learn to be unethical, and you may be very good at it for a while, but it takes practice, it takes strength, and it takes courage to be ethical. And you become stronger at it the more you do it. The more you feed the good wolf, the more you practice ethics, the better you'll be at it. When I look at what happened to me, I really wasn't that bad of a person, but I didn't have the courage, I didn't have the strength to really be ethical. And that's the point I really want to make today, is that you have to work at it to be really ethical. That's why, again, I'll show you the picture of Ethel. It's important that you have something in your life. And I really stress this to college students, because they don't know yet, particularly accounting majors, how many times they're going to be asked to do something unethical. And they have to work at it from day one when they get out of school to be really ethically strong. At this point, I think we have time. I would like to, ask any questions. I love answering questions if you have any. I can end with a joke, but let's go with a question or two. Yes, ma'am.
So I lived in Birmingham from 2000 to 2014.
Oh my goodness.
And my law school professors represented Health South. So this meant a lot to me, and I appreciate it. The question I have is, when all of this was happening, how could your company's lawyers have supported you? Where were the company's lawyers when all this was happening?
I don't know. Our inside counsel, our guy, he's a highly respected lawyer in Alabama now. But no, I forget his name right now. I'm sorry, but anyway, her question is how could the lawyers in our company not see through all of this? Richard had created a cult. Richard made it so unpleasant for you to disagree with him. If you disagreed with him, you didn't keep your job. And he made it so unpleasant for you to disagree with him. And everybody from the board of directors, myself, you became total yes men. And I think when you see large frauds that go on a long time, the culture is kind of like a cult. People like Richard can get away with it because they made millions of dollars for people. And they're thought of as great men, as Richard was until the fraud broke. Other questions? Yes, sir.
First of all, thank you for your speech. I learned a lot. I'm a former prosecutor, so I was really interested when you were talking about your trial.
Yeah.
This is a two-part question. One, did your former colleagues receive a similar sentence to yours? And the second part is, do you believe your sentence was just?
Good questions. I got the shortest prison term of any of the CFOs. Bill Owens, who was really the mastermind of the fraud, he did 5 years. Mike Martin, who was the guy that took my job, he did 3 years. Weston Smith, who was the whistleblower, did 3 years. So I got the lightest. One thing I haven't told you, and I guess I should, the statute of limitations had run on securities fraud for me. So I was technically charged with bank fraud because that statute is 10 years. So I was charged with only bank fraud and not, so that's one reason I think I didn't. What was my sentence fair or just or whatever? Everybody loses when you go to prison. It costs the government $30,000 or $40,000 a year to keep somebody incarcerated. It takes you away from your family. You can't earn for your family. I mean, it would not have served any great purpose for me to have served more prison time. Of course, that's a personal opinion. Let's see. Anyone curious what has happened to Richard? People ask, it's usually the first question. Richard, while he was still at Health South, during the trial and everything, he was under, or even before that, he was under indictment for bribing the governor of Alabama. The governor was running for re-election, and Health South gave him $500,000. When the governor got re-elected, he approved the building of a hospital in Birmingham for Health South. The federal government said that was a bribe. The legal community just laughed. They said seldom is a political contribution considered a bribe. Even if you become the ambassador to Sweden or whatever, it's not considered a bribe. They took he and the governor to trial, and Richard got the Bibles back in the courtroom, and the second time it didn't work. And Richard actually spent 5 years in federal prison in Beaumont, Texas. He is out of prison now. He has a website, if you'd like to go to it, richardscurshey.com. He has written a book. When building a billion-dollar company, here are a few things you should think about. You might want to read that book. He never mentions that he was involved in any kind of fraud. And to this day, he claims he was an innocent man, he was not guilty. Netflix contacted me in 2019 and said they want to do a documentary on Richard. They wanted to know if I'd be part of it, and I said, sure. And it came out in 2020, and it's all about how Richard was found not guilty. There are 6 episodes that in their trials that they felt like the media impacted. And episode 4 is called King Richard. So if you have Netflix, go to Trial by Media, episode 4, King Richard, and you'll see how he was found not guilty. So also, if you Google 60 Minutes, Richard Scrushy, he's on there. And then there was an episode of American Greed that Richard was on in that also. Yes, ma'am.
Were there any women on the board of directors at that time?
One. There was one lady that had been a venture capitalist from the very beginning. Yes.
What was her financial restitution? Did they take everything?
Pretty much. In total, I probably paid about $6 million in restitution. And today I have to go out and give these speeches, and my wife and I are trying to re-retire. But I'm not bitter about it. I should have paid, and I did. And I should have gone to prison, and I did. Yes.
Do you know where they found your replacement? Was it someone that was already there?
Every CFO after me was an employee of the company. Mike Martin, who replaced me, knew all about the fraud going on, and he took the job. No, he couldn't hire from the outside and bring anybody in. So, I do have my books for sale. If y'all like to buy a book after you finish your dessert. And if there's no other questions, I do have a joke. Now, don't get offended because it's a lawyer joke. This little old lady, probably in her 90s, very wealthy, probably lived in a nice section of Dallas, worth a lot of money, and her husband passed away. And she had to deal with selling up the estate. And she never liked lawyers very much, so she tried to do it without hiring a lawyer. But she got down to where she had 3 questions she had to have answered. So she meets with this lawyer. She asked her 3 questions. He answers them. And she's happy. And she said, well, how much do I owe you? And he said, $100. And she said, that's very reasonable. She reaches into her purse and gives him a $100 bill. And she leaves. After she leaves, he notices it's actually 2 $100 bills. So now he's faced with an ethical dilemma. Should he tell his partner? Thank y'all very much.